Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. My name is Alyssa Foster, and I'm an education program coordinator at ACUI, and I have the pleasure of introducing our chair and chair-elect and also our speaker today. So I'll pass it over to Luis if you want to introduce yourself first.
Hi, thanks for joining us today. Um, my name is Luis Jimenez Hinoa. I'm the Associate Dean of the College for Student Living and Wellness here at Vassar College in Poughkeepsie, New York, about an hour and a half north of New York City. And I've served as chair for the last couple of years of the Small Colleges and Universities Network, a real honor on behalf of ACU Hawaii. And I'll turn it over to back to you or back to Isaiah. One of the
Back
two.
to me.
Okay.
I just want to go over a couple things because this is a webinar. It looks a little bit different than a normal Zoom function. So before we dive in, since this is a webinar, even though we cannot see each other, we still hope to have an engaged and interactive session today. There is the chat function, which you should all be familiar with, but there also is a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen where you can enter questions that way as well. Or I think you can also make them anonymous if you prefer that way. And then if you also would like to share out with your voice, you can raise your hand and I can unmute you. You can do things that way, but Isaiah will also include some self-reflection and things with like that today. So I'm honored to introduce our speaker today. So Dr. Isaiah Thomas has worked in higher education for 15 years and brings a deep passion and commitment to both the housing profession and student affairs within the small private liberal arts education environment. As both a first-generation college student and a person of color, Isaiah is deeply committed to helping students of all backgrounds thrive in the college environment in order to make a difference in the greater world. Isaiah currently serves as Assistant Dean of Students at Occidental College, where he oversees the Residential Education and Housing Services Department, as well as the Office of Student Conduct. Isaiah has worked in housing roles at Swarthmore College, Penn State University, Berks Campus, Carleton College, and Semester at Sea. Outside of his current role, Isaiah serves as an affiliate faculty member at Cal Lutheran University, teaching in the counseling education program and board of trustees for the High Mountain Institute. Isaiah is also certified in mental health first aid. In addition to all of that, he's also the chair-elect of this small college and university network at ACUI and is a wonderful addition to the network and has such a deep level of care and understanding for small colleges and universities. So with that, I will turn it over to Isaiah.
Well, hello, everybody. Usually when I'm on Akuhoi webinars, it's usually good afternoon, but I'm maybe of the rare West Coasters. I'll say good morning to my friends on the West Coast and hello to everybody in between. And thank you, Alyssa, for the really kind introduction. Love working with you and Luis on our network. But I'm so happy to present to you all today. And so I'm going to first get us started. I'm going to share my presentation. So will give me just a second to do that. Okay, so I think I'm shared appropriately. Can someone, okay, I got a
You're
thumbs
good.
up. This awesome. So today's presentation is called Disrupting Student Affairs Staff Departure, Examining Needed Changes to the Field of Student Affairs to Attract and Retain a Diverse Workforce. And open my slide. And so maybe I want to start out with just who am I and who is the team because that I worked with because this isn't just something I came up with. This was a research study that I was a member of a three-person team that we led during the pandemic. I think Alyssa did a great job of kind of explaining a little bit about who I am. I'm the chair-elect of the ACU Hawaii Small Colleges and Universities Network, and I'm deeply passionate about small colleges and universities because that is kind of how I got my bread and butter as an undergrad student. And I believe my values are best espoused in those types of environments. Um, I'm a scholar practitioner with over 15 years of experience. My experience mostly is in residence life. Residence life is my home. In my role as assistant dean at my current institution, I oversee some other functional areas, student conduct and veteran services. And so I kind of um, I try to bring multiple lenses and multiple perspectives to my work. I want to own that the majority of my professional experience is at small liberal arts colleges. However, our study is not a study that, as you'll learn soon, it's not about exclusively small liberal arts colleges, and it's also not exclusively about housing. We were looking very general in regards to student affairs. And then the other two members of my research team is Gulden Nayant, who is Associate Professor of Counseling and Higher Education at Northern Illinois University, and is also very involved in ACUHO-I as well. And then Rachel Pridgeon is a former student affairs practitioner. She works in industry now, and she would be okay with me sharing this with you. When we did this study, she found herself very much feeling like a member of our study, because when we started this work, it was about a 1.5 to 2 year research project. She was in student affairs, and then found herself leaving student affairs herself. But this is the research team who kind of made everything happen. So maybe to ground us into this conversation that we're going to have about student affairs departure, kind of 3 questions I'd like you all to kind of maybe self-reflect and think about. So the first is, did you or someone you know in student affairs leave their job during the pandemic? The next question I'd like you to reflect on is, have you had conversations about staff departure during or post-pandemic amongst your professional circles? And so I asked that question to maybe for you all to think about outside of your department, outside of maybe the friends or your circle within your department. Outside of that, are you having conversations maybe with individuals at other institutions? Maybe you're engaged in other groups within ACUHO-I, or maybe some of your regional associations. Has this been a conversation? And then finally, have you participated in conversations and or dialogue amongst your student affairs division or institutional leadership about staff departure? And so think about your division of student affairs that you're a member of, or think about your entire institution. There's, as you all know, there's a lot going on everywhere with a whole variety of things going on. And so reflect on those levels. And so this reflection is meant for you all to think about within your department, within your institution and division of student affairs, and then outside of your institution amongst your professional circles. And then I ask, as you reflect, to just hold on to that while we kind of walk through this presentation. So I want to talk a little bit about how this study came to be. And so to give you all maybe a little bit of background in terms of a little bit of my professional journey. So I came to my current role at Occidental College. I've been in my role for over 5 years, and I came to this role and I started February 2020, February 10th, 2020. The search that I went through was kind of took place in fall 2019. And there really weren't conversations I recall, certainly not in that fall semester, about a global pandemic. As I recall, we maybe started hearing things or murmurings about January 2020. And so I remember I started my job again, February 10th, 2020, thinking that I would be having all these weeks to just absorb everything, to kind of learn on the ground, the institution I'm at, what are the practices, what are the cultures, how I can best make, my talents useful. And kind of a lot of that was thrown at the wayside, because 6 weeks into my start of the new job, I was invited to a meeting at the president's office, and we were having a conversation about messaging that's going to go out to the student body about it was our spring break time, and how we would have to tell students that they cannot return because the global pandemic is here. And so while it's been about, over 5 years from the pandemic, it was a very extraordinary time for our field. and extreme uncertainty. And certainly, as someone who's worked in the field for 15 years, I have not felt anything more jolting, more extraordinary than the global pandemic. Some of you all may recall there are high levels of departures across student affairs, and certainly in housing and residence life going on during that time. And certainly, in my own role, I had my own share of that. We were sadly an institution that had to institute some levels of furloughs, and furloughs touched during that time at all areas of the institution. And so I remember having a conversation with my colleagues, my research team, and just seeing everything. And one of the things that I think we caught on is, in our individual spaces, we often are hearing, well, yeah, people are leaving. It's just the pandemic. It's just the pandemic. It's just the pandemic. And we had a natural curiosity of, is it just the pandemic? Or what about the pandemic? Is it that the pandemic itself was the main cause, or perhaps did the pandemic maybe exacerbate certain things that perhaps we could say has already existed within student affairs, and that this was maybe just the over the cliff moment. And so we felt that there was an opportunity there to delve deeper into this topic. And global pandemics, certainly the intersection of global pandemics and student affairs and higher education, as you all know, is a very under-researched and underdeveloped topic. It kind of didn't exist. And so that is kind of where I think we got this interest in doing this study. So our agenda for today, what I hope to accomplish is we're going to spend some time explaining the research that's grounding the study. So we'll talk about some of the research, again, kind of in our literature review, that kind of paved the way. So you all will be able to get a sense of what were the things maybe going on in student affairs before the pandemic. We're then going to discuss the methodology of our study. And we are then going to discuss the results of the study and explain a departure model to better understand what happened. As you all know, I shared earlier that this study is really about student affairs, but we are here as a part of ACUHO-I. And so I'm going to do my best to root our presentation to our field so that we can think about how this might have impacted the work that we do day in and day out. We'll then have a self-reflection exercise. And when we presented this before, it's been a bit more kind of animated, kind of doing things in person versus virtual. And so given that, and also given that people learn in different ways, I will have some more self-reflection questions for you all to ponder and think about. And then near the end of our presentation, I'll speak about best practices that kind of came through our study, and then we'll have time for Q&A. So hopefully everybody's great with that. That is what my goal is we want to cover. Okay, so let's start with what our current research says. And I don't think that this is going to be too much of a dramatic shock to many of you. So the concept of the exodus or student affairs staff leaving and departing the field, that is not new. We saw that before the pandemic. And that staff retention is also not a new problem. And as you can see, there are many studies we identified that highlighted that retention in student affairs is kind of always been an issue, kind of always something that we have to navigate. And it isn't just, the natural attrition of resident directors, right? That kind of from a residence life perspective we know about. It's beyond that. And that the research also shares that when we look in terms of the issue of the exodus of student affairs staff, and we also look at, staff retention is not new, there are some common challenges that I think student affairs work has and exhibits that contributes to staff retention. And that is demanding hours, stressful work environment, the emotional burden of the work that we do, limited advancement opportunities, and low pay. Now, interestingly, kind of as I've done some even more broader reflection, our research definitely highlighted low pay as a reason individuals depart. But I don't know if this was some of your experiences, but I remember when I started in student affairs, I kind of knew that like, okay, this is, higher education is nonprofit. Like you do this for the love of the students. I think many masters, and if you did a traditional Masters of Student Affairs program, those were the types of messages that I felt at the time that I was a student that many of these programs were espoused. And I remember colleagues sharing with me, well, pay might not be great, but oh my God, the benefits are amazing, especially like the tuition remission benefits. Well, one of the things that I think we are seeing now is we're seeing a lot of for-profit companies and organizations catching up with student affairs in regards to benefits offerings. And so it used to be that student affairs was one of the kind of the only industries that would offer a benefit such as tuition remission, either for yourself or either for your dependents, right? Or your children. And now we are seeing many companies and organizations, especially with the advancement of online education, we're seeing that offering being offered outside of higher education. And so I think an area for further research is just the competitive advantage. That gap is really closing up between um, nonprofit and the for-profit industries. So I just wanted to note that. Continuing in regards to current research, when it comes to change and change management, student affairs professionals often encounter resistance. And I think, I don't know, I think there's a moment where a lot of younger, again, when I reflect on being a kind of a younger student affairs professional, we are kind of trained to be change agents, right? That's a word that again was often used kind of at the beginning of my career. And certainly you need to learn structures and learn practices and learn traditions to understand how to best um, create that change. But that research still shows that change management, especially to address inequity, still is a challenge. Student affairs professionals often also encounter tensions between the values and approaches upheld by the field and the daily reality of their institutions. And so again, student affairs, as a field kind of espouses a variety of values, um, equity and inclusion. I just use that as one example. And student affairs professionals take in the values that they were taught and the values that they believe in and the values that led them to join the field, and then sometimes have tensions when they may are at a workplace where they see decisions being made or practices going on and what they believe isn't being espoused, especially if the institution says we stand for XYZ and in action they don't, or it seems that they're not. And then working conditions, that working conditions can sometimes conflict with personal lives. And I think a lot of where that comes from is, again, I reflect on residential life, our wonderful world. And you all know our jobs often are 24/7, sometimes 365. And that it can sometimes be really challenging to have an ideal personal life that one wants with the working conditions and the requirements of some of the jobs in student affairs. Some more research. So research did show that there is absolutely an emotional toll of supporting students through traumatic events. And I certainly think as residence life professionals, we all have one or many examples of times where maybe you are on call. I mean, you just know if you're going to be in an on-call job, you kind of assume that there's likely going to be a traumatic event and that it's going to be emotional, right? Um, Research also showed that there are institutional barriers when engaging with DEI work. I'm not going to go deep into that. However, please remember that when we did this study, it was before the current administration. And so there were issues before, and I can only imagine the types of issues that colleges and universities and residence life departments and offices are kind of managing in the times that we're in. And coupled with that, racial battle fatigue. And so particularly the challenges that staff of color have to navigate bringing that identity into the workplace. And so, kind of to summarize a lot of what the current research says, while research has highlighted the unique barriers and challenges, especially professionals with minoritized identities encounter, limited attention has been paid to the ways in which systemic oppression may impact their retention. So now I want to talk a little bit about our study. So our study was a qualitative study and it was grounded theory. And our goal of this study was to understand why student affairs professionals leave the field and to examine if and how the global pandemic played a role in that. And again, I will be talking today and really trying to focus a lot on residential life. But again, this wasn't a residential life study. This was broader for all applicable to all student affairs. So our study, what we did is kind of, we created our questions based upon our goals and our literature review and, sought IARB approval. And what we then did is we used kind of methods, including a Kuhoi, to identify a total of 21 former student affairs professionals who left the field of student affairs between March 2020 and March 2022. So you will know in that 2-year time frame, we certainly were deeply impacted by the global pandemic. Participants did represent a variety of student affairs functions and were very diverse in regards to gender identity, sexual orientation, race and ethnicity, familial and marital status, religion, and institutional type. We also did have several of those 21, several of those professionals were residential life professionals, and they served at entry, mid, and senior level positions. So we had our 21 participants. What we then did is we first did a round one where we conducted an interview, a virtual interview with each of those participants via Zoom. And the goal of our first interview was on us kind of developing a rapport, getting to know the participant, where they're coming from, the type of work that they do. And then we delved right in of learning why they left student affairs. And as you can imagine, everybody, while there were similarities, everyone had their own narrative and their own story. And then we also were interested, one of the questions we asked all of our participants was their willingness to return to student affairs. I think sometimes we might make the assumption that people leave and are never coming back. We did not want to make that assumption. And also there was a dearth of research about the concept of making a return to student affairs. And so we wanted to learn more about, for those that left the field, would they come back to the field? And if so, what things would they need to do or think about to consider coming back to the field? So like any qualitative study, information was gathered and synthesized, and we developed initial themes. And when our research team pulled together all those initial themes, we love the idea of, is there any way visually we can depict what is going on here? And so we developed a model that we called a departure model. To kind of visually display kind of what is going on in regards to based upon what we've learned from our participants. So what we did was we developed that model, and then after we developed that model, we then scheduled second interviews with all of our participants. The goal of the second interview was multi-pronged. We wanted to get a follow-up from them. How are they doing? For many of them, they did not return to student affairs, or at least at that point. So I was interested in kind of how is outside student affairs work going? Are there things you're missing from working in student affairs? Are there things that you're loving by not working in student affairs? And then for a few participants in our study, they actually returned to student affairs. And so that allowed us to have a conversation about, okay, so in interview one, you said, here are the things you needed to be able to return. What happened? Please explain how you returned and what is different, and such. So we did that. We also showed the model to them to just get their initial impressions. Again, the model represented the themes that we collected from all 21 participants. Might not have obviously included every single experience that each individual participant had, but again, themes are identifying things that many participants maybe experienced together. And so we use that kind of as a way to see, are we right on this? Are we missing something? Is there something unclear? And so after we had that second interview, that allowed us to refine our model. And then we spent the rest of the time uh, kind of drafting out our study and sending it to kind of different journals and such that might have been interested in publishing this research. And we were very lucky that the Journal of College Student Development, their 100-year anniversary, decided to highlight our study as one of the articles for that edition. And at the end of this presentation, I have the link as well as a QR code to the article. So you'll be able to read a bit more in depth, and I will say a bit more technical understanding of our study if you read that article. So I just want to plug that now, but we'll come back to that at the end of our study. So then before I move on to the next slide, I'm going to prepare you for what you're going to see and what we're going to do. The next slide is actually going to be a visual depiction of our model. I'm going to put it up on the screen, but I'm not actually going to explain it from the screen. The model is very technical. I wish it was a very easy linear model, but it is not, because as you'll see, departure is not, this concept isn't linear. It isn't the easiest kind of model to understand. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it up on the screen, probably for about 20 to 30 seconds, so you all can kind of get a taste, get a see of what it is. And then I'm going to move on to other slides that of which I'm able to kind of piece through different parts of the model and explain verbally what you saw. So that will be our plan. So here is what the departure model looks like. So some of the things you'll see is you'll see some large circles, which represent themes. You see a lot of arrows going from one maybe bucket to a different bucket, or an arrow leading to a conclusion or a feeling. This again was the model that we showed all of our participants in our study and was able to be refined. And again, as scary or as intimidating this may look, I promise you in our next kind of 3 to 4 slides, we're going to break through and talk about all of these different pieces. So I'm going to leave this up for about another 10 to 15 seconds so you all can look at it. And I apologize. When I copied this over to the PowerPoint, it's possible that on some of your screens, you might not be able to see some of the words or some of the themes. But again, my goal is to talk through that with you all. So about 10 more seconds, I will leave this up and then we will move on. Okay, so let's chat. So first, in terms of where our model starts, is this idea that we are all socialized into the field. You all may recall earlier, I talked a lot about my socialization, what I learned in graduate school, for example. And so if you chose that route to work in student affairs, knowing that there are many routes, some don't go through graduate programs. But we are all socialized into this field, what we learn in graduate school and our own values and identities. And so it almost reminds me of Aston's IEO model of the inputs, right? College students come to college with a set of experiences, identities and such. That's kind of where they start, right? Same with us. We came into this field with a certain set of values, expectations, identities, so on and so forth. Once we are in the workplace, there are many factors that have either a positive or what we call mitigating impact, or a negative or exacerbating impact on how we were socialized. So if there's a really big way to think about the model in the most simplest form, we have our inputs, how we're socialized in the field. The more positive or mitigating things that happen in our job or in the course of our career that happen, the more likely we're going to continue to maintain and be retained in our work and in this field. And the more negative or exacerbating impacts that we might experience in the workplace are going to potentially lead to departure. And conflict sometimes exists when we experience both mitigating and exacerbating impacts. And that on the model is where you might see two arrows that are pointing near each other. And so I wanted to give an example of what this could be. And so an example of this is understanding the expectation of a job, but life circumstances and personal priorities may have shifted. And so oftentimes in residential life, we see or think of the resident director role as kind of an entry-level role. Sometimes people think of it as, yep, it's a 2 to 4 year role mostly. And one of the common reasons why that role is thought about is because, as you all know, kind of the resident director role is a live-in role. They have an apartment, but they live in a residence hall around undergraduate college students. And they have to be on call. Sometimes as individuals get older, we see that for the resident director role or that person, their life circumstances may change, such as they may want to have a family. And that might not be so compatible with the role. Or there might be some institutions that had or have a pet policy, but someone really wants to have their pet there. Or, something personal in their life may happen. There may be a medical issue. There may be a familial issue that may clash maybe with some of the expectations that a job might present. And so that's kind of an example of sometimes of mitigating and exacerbating impacts. So I want to talk about a few of the other buckets or the circles that you saw. So I don't think this should be surprising, but workplace conflict kind of listed significantly as a factor of why individuals depart. And I don't think that's a higher education thing. I don't think that's a student affairs concept. I think that probably exists in any type of workplace environment there is. And kind of three areas, again, I don't think this will be a surprise to you, is the direct supervisor, colleagues, and institutional leadership. I want to highlight, again, our concept going back to mitigating and exacerbating impacts. All of these three issues and all of these can be both mitigating and exacerbating. Unfortunately, in our study, we studied individuals that left the field. So you can understand that a lot of these were, by our participants, were lifted up as exacerbating or negative impacts. So a challenging, inflexible supervisor, a supervisor who wasn't kind, a supervisor who didn't listen to their staff, a collegial environment that wasn't maybe kind. It wasn't very inclusive of new staff, or maybe the culture amongst the colleagues was not healthy. Institutional leadership. And so perhaps some of our participants shared, a lack of transparency around the direction of how an institution is moving or going. That one week it seems like the institution cares about one set of things, and the next week it seems like the institution completely changes and thinks about others. Or institutional leadership can also, we heard, we've not had a vice president of student affairs in a year, or we've had interim presidents in and out and in and out. And it's just very, very challenging to understand the institution right now when perhaps leadership is very fractured. Another bucket of things we discovered in our study was institutional policies or practices that are rooted in white supremacy. And so some of the examples of that were, and again, I just want to highlight that this study was done before the current, I would say, attacks and, in my opinion, destruction of DEI in many colleges and universities around the country. But, our participants lifted up that many institutions have these diversity, equity, inclusion statements that they say that, they aspire to be this or aspire to do that or aspire to serve this group of students. And it's not realized or felt in actuality by the staff. What was also highlighted is high expectations for worker and inadequate pay, as well as pay equity issues amongst minoritized staff. We still see, not just in student affairs, but in all industries, people of color and women often still make less than the majority, right, in most job fields. And that certainly still rings true in our industry. And so in terms of I'll go back to the high expectations for workers and inadequate pay. One of the things we often heard specifically over the pandemic was, oh, well, now that there's a pandemic, we now need you to do this and this and this and this and this. And you're just, in some cases, we were just lucky to be told, this is why we were able to even keep you in a job, not even addressing the fact that this is additional work that needs additional compensation, but this idea of you should be so lucky to do it because we're not going to furlough you or eliminate your job because of the pandemic. And then also within that bucket is lack of diversity within leadership at the top. And so often in research shares, when you see individuals that look like you, there's a feeling that a deeper sense of belonging and a feeling, especially for minoritized staff, that they feel as though if a school says that they're about DEI and their leadership looks like that, then that is a sign that they mean what they say. They talk the talk, they walk the walk. Another bucket is obviously the environmental context. And specifically, the environment certainly, yes, can mean your workplace, your office, that. But within this study, we focused on environmental context, specifically about the environment of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so, as we all know, COVID was a game changer and did certainly impact departure. I'd like to remind everybody that during COVID-19, it was not just the global pandemic going on. There was a racial reckoning also going on in the United States of America. And I listed the George Floyd incident, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor. And so a lot of staff, or at least in our studies, shared not only we have the COVID pandemic going on, but there are a lot of personal issues going on in the world, a lot of significant injustices. For some of our participants, um, even if work could have been fine, right? There weren't any issues perhaps for them during the pandemic. The racial reckoning in the United States for some individuals could have been enough to say, I need a break. I can't even my job is fine, but given what is going on or how I'm showing up at work, how I'm feeling about things, maybe this job or this type of role or working in general, this isn't right for me right now. And then you all may recall that the Great Resignation, yes, it was certainly in higher education, but it was well documented within all industries. And so some of you all may have friends, partners, loved ones, family members who experienced job resignation, them leaving their jobs, no matter what the industry was during the time for a variety of reasons. So again, in our study, environmental context played mostly an exacerbating impact, which again led to departure. So I gave a very big picture view of the model and kind of did my best to kind of break down those pieces for you. I want to now talk a little bit about some of the lessons that were learned from this study and applications to our praxis. And so the first kind of theme we unraveled was this idea of conflicts of identities with ideal worker norms. And so when we say ideal worker norms, at least in the United States context, there is this concept of like, what does it mean to have a job in the United States? It means, so the idea of working a 9 to 5, that is kind of ideal worker norms. Cultural, even things like, you work until the job gets done. Even ideas of like, you should be lucky to have a job, you shouldn't complain. There are a lot of things that are embedded in regards to ideal worker norms, particularly within the context of the United States. And one of the things we often understood, we saw in the study, was that a lot of individuals' personal identities clashed with some of those things. I think I will just name flexible work or hybrid work was a significant clash because when we think about ideal worker norms pre-COVID, for many of us, the concept of hybrid or flexible work arrangements wasn't even a thing. You show up to work and it is what it is. And so, what some schools did during the pandemic, and what we certainly think institutions and universities continue to need to do, is to reevaluate policies and practices that are based upon both the identities and the needs of employees. Some examples for that, particularly as often I think about residence life work, is what could or what does hybrid or flexible work arrangements and schedules look like? What is the on-campus housing arrangement for your live-in staff? And so that includes, are children allowed? What is your pet policy? What does the separation of work and personal life look like? In terms of after-hour work responsibilities and expectations, we certainly understand that for some jobs, there may be a time where an employee may just not want after-hour work responsibilities and expectations, and that departure might be necessary. But we often say we're advocating for there is still a conversation about what those after-hour work responsibilities and expectations are. I often, in my own work, I often advocate for, because sometimes, and maybe I've experienced this at small institutions, but I think I have experienced in my own work sometimes this feeling that, oh, because the live-in staff are live-on and they're the only live-on staff at the college, any work or anything that needs to be done, even last minute after hours, should just go to the on-call staff or the live-on staff because they're here. And I've had to work hard to have conversations to remind folks that all these additional responsibilities are not the reason why live-in staff live in. The majority of us live-in staff live in specifically to serve in an on-call crisis management kind of protocol for our departments. And so if we're now talking about things beyond that, it's not to say that can't happen, but there needs to be a conversation about that. Because if there's not a conversation, if there's an assumption being made, that is going to be a tension point. Reward systems. And so thinking about what are things that we can do to honor people for their work. And so that might be many departments have great like award ceremonies to kind of recognize staff. This could look a variety of different ways, and also in certain circumstances could include additional compensation. And then looking at reevaluating what types of advancement opportunities exist. And so sometimes individuals leave because there isn't an advancement opportunity. One of the things that I've observed, and again, this may be mostly, I can only speak with my experience working at small colleges and universities, but I've been really keen to look at the progression of work and promotion opportunities within admissions departments. Because in the several institutions that I've worked at, kind of there is a path of admissions counselor, maybe then it goes to assistant director, then senior assistant director, then associate director, then senior associate director. And so there is kind of a built-in progression, and I really like that. I also know there's some institutions that have those types of progressions built into a lot of your administrative assistant type positions where maybe after a certain amount of time, there's a promotion opportunity to senior administrative assistant. Obviously, different institutions have different rules, have different processes, have different politics around this. Certainly, it can be even more layered with this issue as it becomes to any of your unionized staff, if you're at a school that has some or all unionized staff. But I think but I think it still warrants a conversation and reflection about what are ways that perhaps we can try to create advancement opportunities. Because, yeah, we know people can leave and move on, but if there's a way we can retain them, then why, would it be in our best interest to do that, especially if we as an institution, as a department, as a leader, benefit from their history of knowledge and their contributions. And then finally, for here, what do we and can we, and by we, I mean a department and an institution, stand for now as it pertains to DEI? And just the reality of the situation is we all have to answer that question very differently because of where we live. If we work for a public institution, if you work at a public institution in a red state, for example, that is going to be very different. I live in Los Angeles, California, and I work at a private institution. So I just happen to know that, how I think and what we can do is different than other institutions. Understanding that for some folks, that might lead to their departure, right? That's nothing your department can do. And sometimes it's nothing your institution or your VPSA can do. It's you maybe work for a land grant institution with a conservative majority with an active legislature that wants to control dollars in your system. And so there's nothing individually you can do about that, and that might lead to departure. But again, it still warrants the conversation. Another bucket or another kind of category is this idea of the misalignment of espoused and enacted values. I spoke about this a little bit earlier in terms of the research, but I think one of the things that is really, really important is how we prepare our staff for the realities of working in student affairs. What comes with that is centering equity, inclusion, and policy and practices, assuming you care about it. If it's something that is fractured or frayed, like I kind of come from the motto is I don't, if you're going to say equity and inclusion, even nowadays, you're going to have to back it up to individuals that are entering the field. You're going to have to show examples of that. And perhaps it might be, here's what the institution isn't doing, but maybe here are the things we are doing in my own department. Here are the things we can do despite the landscape. And then I also want to lift up transparency, clear job descriptions, and navigating the departmental, institutional, and external politics of it all. And so I think as I reflect on my career thus far in student affairs, it's always hard to see people leave a job when they say, like, well, when I took this job, this is what it said I would be doing. And in reality, here is what it is. I think that's one of the worst, in my opinion, one of the worst ways for someone to depart, because I think that is completely fixable. And in fact, as leaders, as managers, as directors, as deans, that's our responsibility. And so we need to be very, very clear to prepare individuals for this work. Not that this study covered it, but I think an emerging and an ongoing and emergent conversation that I know is going on in student affairs, and especially the housing and residence life world, is the expectations of Gen Z as they are now working age adults entering the work of student affairs. And I can tell you, as a self-proclaimed elder millennial, Gen Z's needs and expectations of jobs and the workplace and of leadership are certainly different than my expectations. And if you are Gen X or in the boomer generation, very, very different. And so one of the ways I think we can bridge that gap in a very easy way is to be very clear about what are we asking you to do? And sometimes we know that in some positions, things might need to change and such. Well, if you know that is the case, you need to find a way to explain what that looks like, or if it's going to happen, what is the process? And so, for example, if you're hiring a resident director, but you know, for example, that your department is going through a change of maybe how you do on-call, you might want to share some of that information or what that process is, and especially sharing the why, because I think we have a responsibility, especially as we're recruiting. I sometimes feel some of our colleagues in our work don't really understand the gravity of someone potentially is lifting up and uprooting their lives, uprooting their families' lives to take a job. That is serious. That is really, really serious and important. And I feel we have to honor that. I feel we have to respect that. And I think this is a very easy way we can do that. Underneath this category as well is a reevaluation of policies and practices and their adherence to espoused values. And again, centering equity and inclusion in policies and practices, celebrating student and staff identities, and then prioritizing staff well-being. I think the pandemic woke many of us up to the importance of staff well-being. I used to think that when we always talked about wellness and mental health, certainly, we all understand that that's a very active conversation amongst students, but I feel now that the pandemic is forcing us to reflect our own well-being, our own mental health, and I think we need to continue to do that. And then the next for praxis is addressing conflict and department culture. Certainly, this was another area of which, many of our participants, many of our participants did not leave or departed student affairs because, oh, there's a pandemic and I don't want to work in student affairs. It was the intersection of the global pandemic and things they experienced during that. And a lot of it was conflict and departmental culture. And so, three questions that I pose, to think about in regards to how you address conflict and culture within your department is the first being, how do you address conflict within your department culture? Is the process for addressing conflict different for senior leaders versus entry-level staff? And if so, why? What is the intersection between conflict and identity? Knowing the importance of diversity and inclusion practices, how does identity, sorry, I said identify, how does identity come into play? And then how do you address conflict and culture issues outside of your department? Are there spaces and opportunities for staff to share concerns? And is the culture receptive to feedback and open to change? And so maybe the one thing I will lift up here is as I was navigating my way up within student affairs within my context, as a younger entry-level professional, I often saw the round table of senior leaders at my institution and in my department. And that's fine. The issue was never that there is a table for that happening. The issue was, what is the connection between that and me as an entry-level staff member? Do I feel as though that circle has my best interests? Do I just feel that circle is having conversations about this is what you need to make entry-level staff do and you need to make it happen, right? And so we're not saying that these hierarchies don't need to exist. In fact, they do need to exist. But again, I remember I talked a little bit earlier about transparency and such. There's still a pathway between a staff member, no matter what level they are, and that circle, whether that circle is the leadership within your department, whether that's your leadership within your division, or whether that's leadership within your institution. But what does that pathway look like? And how do we know that the feedback or what is experienced on the ground by staff is being discussed and realized and considered? So knowing that we won't have tons and tons of time, and I know I want to get to answer any of the Q&A questions, but I wanted to offer kind of some self-reflection, some takeaways from this for no matter if you're a director of residential life, if you're a dean, whether you're an RD, an assistant director, here are some things I'd like you to self-reflect on. So number one is, what can I do in my current role, big or small, to disrupt staff departure? And I list some examples. So perhaps, again, it's important, before I go into the examples, it's important to me to note that cultural change isn't just necessarily all the big dramatic changes. Little things matter. And so that is why everybody has a role. No matter if you're the director of residential life or if you're a resident director, everybody has a role. We feel in disrupting staff departures. So it could be something as maybe small as making sure to say hello and committing to saying hello to each new staff member every time I see them in passing. And maybe as a director, it might be that you're going to annually review departmental policies to measure and ensure staff retention. And then the next self-reflection prompt for you all is, if you were offered a 15-minute meeting with your vice president of student affairs, what is one suggestion you could provide that can aid in improving divisional culture and cohesion? Again, big or small. So an example of that could be a semesterly happy hour or lunch for all staff with the aim of building community and getting to know individuals from beyond their desk or Zoom screen. Or perhaps maybe even bigger, developing a divisional assessment to examine staff satisfaction and develop strategies for broad improvement. And I know some of you all maybe are in positions that get 15 minutes with your vice president of student affairs, and some may not. So those are some self-reflection kind of takeaways I hope you all take with you and continue to think about. Before we move, we have a few, maybe time for one Q&A. You all know I was very passionate about this, but I did want to highlight, there's a QR code for you all to scan. So again, our article was published in the Journal of College Student Development. And so we're really proud and honored for that. And for a deeper look in this, especially for a more granular look at our model, especially for maybe some of y'all on screens or phones that really couldn't see our model, the article has it all laid out in more detail. And so I want to thank you all for that. And I want to see if I have time for any Q&As.
We have about 1 minute, but we have an anonymous question that I can read. Have you used assessment results, examples Myers-Briggs, StrengthsQuest, Gallup, etc., to address staff conflict? And if not, would you recommend it?
That's a really great question. We have used, so I'm going to talk to just me as a practitioner here. We have used StrengthsQuest in our department a few years ago to explain, to learn more about each other. What's really interesting, to be honest, about when we did it was I remember that we had some staff that had some of their top five. For those of y'all that know StrengthsQuest, you get it like a top five. And we were a little surprised because we had some staff members that were struggling. Specifically, we had some staff members that I honestly think were ready to not be on call anymore. And so maybe some of their strengths they weren't exhibiting because they maybe weren't their best selves at the time. So I do think that some of these inventories are great places to start to kind of work through and manage that. What I would offer though is I sometimes feel personally that sometimes it isn't complicated. Like I feel like sometimes people want to use Myers-Briggs or some of these inventories in a broader way when the issue is staff are like, you don't let me talk during a staff meeting. You don't need Myers-Briggs or StrengthsQuest to like figure out, hey, can we have more of an opportunity so that everybody can be on a more equal playing field of sharing and contributing in staff meeting? And so for those, what I do in my practice is I often meet kind of every other month with even the resident director staff to just do a check-in. How are you doing? How are things going? So that pipeline that I was talking about, because in my role, I am sometimes seen as at that table at the top, and I have to build in ways to kind of mitigate that so they know that I represent them and their values and their interests. And if they see something that isn't happening, I can explain to them directly why.
Thanks. So since we do have a hard stop at 1, if you have further questions, you can email Isaiah or me, and I can get them to Isaiah. But I want to thank Isaiah. This has been a great webinar. Thanks for joining us. I want to point out that Linda Wiley has put the request for Student Affairs certification in the chat, and this recording will be on YouTube in the next few days. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
You too.
Well done, friend.